She had always loved the sound of a piano, even before she understood how it worked. As a child, she would stop walking whenever she heard music floating out of an open window. She would stand still, eyes closed, listening as if the notes were telling her a secret. Music felt safe to her. It felt like a place where no one could laugh at her, judge her clothes, or remind her of what her family could not afford. Her family lived in a small rented house at the edge of town. The walls were thin, and during winter the cold slipped through the cracks. Her mother worked long hours cleaning offices and event halls. Her father had once worked at a factory, but when it shut down, everything became uncertain. Money was always counted carefully. Extra things like music lessons were never even discussed. Still, she found her own way to learn. A few streets away stood a community center. Every Friday evening, soft piano music could be heard from inside during gatherings and rehearsals. She would pretend to pass by on her way home from school, but she always slowed down near the entrance. If the doors were slightly open, she would sit quietly on the steps and listen. Sometimes she imagined her fingers moving across invisible keys in her lap. She memorized melodies without knowing their names. Months earlier, someone had thrown away an old, broken keyboard near a trash area. A few keys did not work, and the speakers buzzed, but she carried it home anyway. She cleaned it carefully and placed it on a small wooden table near the window. Every evening, after finishing homework and chores, she practiced. She pressed the working keys again and again, trying to match the songs she had heard outside the community center. She did not know about technique or posture. She only knew how the music should feel. Most people around her never noticed her quiet passion. At school, she kept to herself. She was not the loudest in class, not the most confident, and certainly not the richest. Her shoes were simple. Her bag had been stitched twice at the corner. She learned early how to ignore whispers. One afternoon, her mother came home looking more tired than usual. There was a large event scheduled at one of the town's most beautiful halls, and extra help was needed. Her mother asked if she could come along after school to assist with small tasks, arranging chairs, wiping tables, carrying light decorations. She agreed immediately. Any time spent with her mother felt important. The event hall was nothing like their home. It had tall glass windows, shining floors, and large golden lights hanging from the ceiling. Workers moved quickly, setting up flower arrangements and polishing silver trays. Everything looked expensive and delicate. In the center of the hall stood a grand piano. She had seen pictures of such pianos before, but never this close. It was glossy black, reflecting the lights above like a mirror. The lid was slightly open, and the keys looked perfectly aligned, smooth and untouched. It did not look broken or worn like her keyboard at home. It looked powerful. She tried not to stare, but her eyes kept returning to it. While her mother focused on arranging tablecloths, she quietly wiped down chairs and stacked napkins. Every time she passed the piano, her steps slowed. She felt as if the instrument was calling her, reminding her of all the evenings she had spent practicing alone. Guests began arriving just before sunset. They wore elegant clothes and spoke confidently. Their laughter echoed through the hall. Some discussed business matters. Others greeted each other warmly, as if this was their usual circle. She suddenly felt out of place in her simple outfit. She stayed close to the walls, careful not to draw attention. The scheduled pianist had not arrived yet. A few guests glanced at the stage area where the piano stood waiting. Soft background music played from speakers, but it did not compare to the real sound of live keys. As the hall grew busier, she noticed something. For a brief moment, no one was near the piano. Her heart began to beat faster. She told herself she would only look closely, nothing more. She wiped her hands nervously on her dress and stepped toward it. Standing beside it, she could see her reflection in the polished surface. She hesitated. What if someone saw her? What if they thought she was trying to damage it? But curiosity and love were stronger than fear. Very gently, she lowered herself onto the bench. The cushion felt softer than she expected. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a second, she simply breathed. Then she pressed one key. The sound was clear, deep, and beautiful. It vibrated in the air differently than her broken keyboard at home. She pressed another key, then a third. The notes blended smoothly. Without thinking, she began playing a melody she had practiced many nights. It was not perfect, but it carried feeling. Her hands moved carefully, trying to remember every pause and transition. For those few seconds, the busy hall disappeared. She was back in her small room, near the window, playing while the evening breeze moved the curtains. She did not notice that a small group of guests had turned their heads. At first, they seemed confused. Then their expressions changed. One woman raised an eyebrow. A man let out a short laugh. Another whispered something that caused a few others to smile in a way that did not feel kind. She became aware of the eyes on her. The melody faltered. "Who is that?" someone said quietly, but loud enough for her to hear. "Is she part of the staff?" another voice asked. A soft chuckle followed. "Does she even know how to play?" Her fingers froze above the keys. The warmth she had felt only moments earlier disappeared. Her cheeks grew hot. She stood up quickly, almost knocking the bench back. "I'm sorry," she said softly, though no one had directly spoken to her. The small group continued watching her. One of them stepped closer to the piano, inspecting it as if checking whether it had been harmed. She felt smaller with every passing second. An event organizer approached, drawn by the unusual scene. He looked at her, then at the guests, then at the piano. His smile was polite but firm. "This instrument is reserved for the performer," he said gently. "Please step away." She nodded immediately. She did not try to explain that she only played for a moment. She did not mention the hours she had practiced at home. She simply stepped back. As she returned to the side of the hall, she heard another whisper behind her. "Everyone wants to be a musician these days." A few quiet laughs followed. Her eyes dropped to the floor. She focused on breathing slowly, willing herself not to cry. She reminded herself that she had no right to feel upset. After all, it was not her piano. It was not her event. She was only there to help. Still, something inside her hurt deeply. Not because they stopped her, but because of how easily they dismissed her. She moved toward the back of the hall and picked up a tray to carry glasses. Her hands were slightly shaking. She kept replaying the moment in her mind. How beautiful the first note had sounded, and how quickly everything changed. The scheduled pianist was still delayed. Guests began checking their watches. Conversations grew louder to fill the silence. The grand piano remained untouched now, its lid shining under the lights. She avoided looking at it again. Her mother noticed her quietness and asked softly if everything was all right. She nodded and forced a small smile. She did not want to create trouble or draw attention. As the evening continued, the delay became more noticeable. A few guests expressed mild frustration. The organizer stepped aside to make phone calls, trying to find out where the performer was. She stood near the wall, holding a folded cloth in her hands, wondering why she had allowed herself to believe she belonged on that bench, even for a second. But deep inside, beneath the embarrassment, one truth remained unchanged. When she touched those keys even briefly, she had felt alive. And no whisper, no laugh, and no disapproving look could erase that feeling completely. The sound of quiet laughter did not last long, but the feeling it left behind stayed with her. She kept her head down and continued helping with small tasks, but her mind was far away. Every time she walked past the center of the hall, she felt the weight of what had happened. The piano stood there like a reminder. Just minutes ago it had felt like a dream within reach. Now it felt like a door that had been shut firmly in her face. Guests were growing restless. The background music playing through the speakers sounded dull and lifeless compared to what the evening was meant to be. A few people checked their phones again. Some moved toward the refreshment tables. Conversations grew louder, not because they were happy, but because they were trying to fill the silence. Near the entrance, the event organizer was speaking in a low, tense voice on his phone. From the way he rubbed his forehead, it was clear that the situation was not improving. The scheduled pianist was stuck outside town due to unexpected traffic. No one knew how long it would take. One of the guests from earlier glanced at the piano and shook his head. "This is embarrassing," he muttered to someone beside him. "A grand instrument sitting there and no one to play it." She heard that sentence clearly. It felt sharp. She moved toward the back corridor to collect more folded napkins. The hallway was quiet and dim compared to the bright hall. For a moment, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She replayed the melody she had started earlier. In her mind, she continued it perfectly. No interruptions. No laughter. She wondered why it hurt so much. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her. At school, when projects required special materials, she was often the last to bring them. When classmates talked about private lessons or weekend hobbies, she stayed silent. She had learned to live with quiet differences. But music was different. Music was the one thing that made her feel equal. She opened her eyes and straightened herself. There was still work to do. She carried the napkins back into the hall, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. Near the stage area, an elderly woman sat alone at one of the side tables. Unlike the others, she had not been laughing earlier. Her eyes were thoughtful, observant. She had watched everything without speaking. As the girl passed by, the woman gently stopped her. "Excuse me," she said kindly. Her heart skipped. For a second, she feared another warning. "Yes," she replied softly. "You were the one playing a few minutes ago, weren't you?" She hesitated, unsure whether admitting it would cause more trouble. I just touched a few keys," she said carefully. The woman studied her face. It did not sound like just touching. It sounded like someone who knows the instrument. She felt a mix of surprise and disbelief. No one had said that before. "I only practice at home," she explained quickly. "I don't have lessons." The woman nodded slowly, as if that detail confirmed something she already suspected. "Music does not always begin in classrooms," she said quietly. Before she could respond, one of the organizing staff members approached the woman to discuss the delayed performance. The girl stepped back again, returning to her duties. But this time, something inside her felt slightly lighter. The discussion near the stage grew more serious. The main performer would not arrive for at least another hour. The evening schedule was falling apart. Some guests suggested postponing the musical portion. Others recommended playing recorded music and moving forward with speeches. The elderly woman stood up from her seat and walked toward the organizer. Their conversation was quiet, but from their gestures, it was clear they were debating something unexpected. A few moments later, the organizer looked across the hall, directly at her. Her stomach tightened. He motioned for her to come forward. Every step toward him felt heavy. Guests nearby turned their heads again. She could almost feel their earlier judgment returning. The organizer cleared his throat. "We have a small delay," he announced to a nearby group, forcing a polite smile. "In the meantime, we might have a brief, informal performance." Murmurs spread quickly. He turned to her. "You said you play?" She glanced at the elderly woman, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I try," she answered honestly. The organizer looked uncertain. "This is a formal event," he said under his breath. "We can't afford a mistake." The elderly woman spoke firmly but calmly. "Sometimes the greatest mistake is ignoring hidden talent." A short silence followed. Finally, the organizer sighed. "Just one piece," he said quietly to the girl. "Something short." Her hands immediately grew cold. This was not the same as playing alone for a few seconds. Now everyone would be watching. Not whispering from a distance, but openly waiting to see whether she would fail. Word spread through the hall quickly. Guests returned to their seats, curious. Some looked amused, clearly expecting a small disaster to entertain them. She walked toward the piano slowly. The same instrument that had felt like a dream now felt like a test. As she sat down on the bench again, the room buzzed with quiet conversation. She could hear small comments. "Is this a joke? Who is she? Let's see how this goes." Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. For a second, doubt tried to take control. What if her fingers slipped? What if she forgot the melody? What if the broken keys at home had tricked her into believing she was better than she actually was? She closed her eyes. She remembered the small room at home, the soft evening light, the cracked window, the way her mother would pause in the doorway sometimes, listening quietly without interrupting. She placed her fingers on the keys. The first note came out softer than before, but steady. The room was still restless. A few quiet laughs remained. She pressed the second note, then the third. This time she did not rush. She allowed the melody to unfold slowly, just as she practiced it. Each note connected carefully to the next. Her breathing began to match the rhythm. Something changed in the air. The whispers began to fade. She moved into the main part of the piece, her fingers flowing more confidently now. The rich sound of the grand piano filled the hall, reaching every corner. It was fuller, deeper, and more powerful than the small keyboard at home. It responded to her touch in a way that surprised even her. A man near the front leaned forward slightly. A woman who had laughed earlier lowered her glass slowly. The sound was no longer background noise. It demanded attention. She was no longer thinking about the guests. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling a story through the keys. A story of quiet evenings, of practicing while others slept, of believing in something even when no one else noticed. The melody grew stronger. Her hands stopped trembling. The hall became completely silent. For the first time that evening, the piano was not an expensive decoration. It was alive, and so was she. The last note of her short performance faded gently into the air. For a brief second, there was only silence. Not the awkward kind from earlier, but a deep, thoughtful silence. Felt as if the entire hall was holding its breath. Then a single clap broke through. It came from the elderly woman standing near the front. Her expression was calm but proud, as if she had expected this all along. The sound of her clapping echoed across the room. A few others slowly joined in. Then more. Within moments, the hall was filled with applause. She opened her eyes slowly, almost unsure whether the sound was real. Her hands were still resting lightly on the keys. She looked up and saw something she had not seen earlier that evening. Respect. Not from everyone. Some faces still looked surprised, even confused. But the laughter was gone. She stood up carefully from the bench, unsure of what to do next. Her heart was still beating fast, but now it felt different. It was not fear. It was disbelief. The organizer stepped forward, clearing his throat again. This time his voice sounded less tense. "Well," he said with a small smile, "that was unexpected." A few guests nodded in agreement. "You saved us from an empty stage," he added, almost joking, though his tone carried honesty. She lowered her gaze slightly, unsure how to respond. Compliments felt unfamiliar. She had imagined moments like this before, but in her imagination, she always felt confident. In reality, she felt shy and exposed. The elderly woman approached her near the piano. "What is your name?" she asked softly. She told her quietly. "Have you ever taken formal lessons?" the woman asked. She shook her head. "No, ma'am. I just practice at home." "On what instrument?" She hesitated for a second, embarrassed. "An old keyboard. Some keys don't work." The woman smiled gently. "That makes this even more impressive." Nearby, two guests who had whispered earlier were now speaking in lower tones. "I didn't expect that," one admitted. "Neither did I," the other replied. "She has control. That takes discipline." Their words reached her ears, and though they were not directly speaking to her, she heard the change clearly. The organizer received another phone call. After a short conversation, he returned with an update. The main performer would not arrive at all. A sudden road closure had made it impossible. A wave of disappointment spread through the room again. The organizer looked at the elderly woman, then at the girl. "This is a difficult situation," he said quietly. "We need music for at least the next hour. The program cannot move forward without it." The elderly woman did not hesitate. "Let her play." Murmurs started again, but they were different now. They were not mocking. They were uncertain. "An hour is a long time," someone whispered. "What if she only knew that one piece?" another voice said. The organizer looked at her carefully. "Can you continue?" he asked gently. "Do you know more?" Her mind raced. She did know more. She had memorized several melodies over the years. Some incomplete, some polished. But playing one short piece was different from carrying an entire evening. Fear tried to return. What if she made a mistake now? What if the applause from earlier had only been polite surprise? She looked down at the keys again. They no longer seemed intimidating. They felt familiar. "I can try," she said honestly. The elderly woman placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Trying is enough. Chairs were adjusted. Guests returned to their seats. This time they did not seem restless. They seemed curious. She sat down again, inhaled slowly, and began with a softer melody, one that felt calm and welcoming. It was a piece she had created herself by combining parts of different songs she had heard through the community center doors. The room gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm. Conversations lowered. Glasses were placed gently on tables. The music flowed through the hall like warm light. As she continued, something inside her shifted. She was no longer playing to prove anything. She was playing because she loved it. Each note felt natural, not forced. Halfway through her second piece, she allowed herself to glance at the audience. The same woman who had raised her eyebrow earlier was now leaning slightly forward. Her expression softened. A man who had laughed quietly before was listening with folded hands. Even the organizer, who had once asked her to step away from the piano, was watching with genuine interest. The elderly woman stood near the side, observing not just the performance but the transformation in the room. Music has a strange way of removing distance between people. It does not ask about background or clothing. It only asks to be heard. As she moved into a more energetic melody, her fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence. The grand piano responded beautifully. Its sound filled every space, strong but smooth. For the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be fully seen for something she loved. Not pitted, not ignored, not underestimated. Seen. After several pieces, she paused briefly to drink water. Light applause followed each melody now, not loud or dramatic, but warm and steady. During the short break, the elderly woman approached her again. "You have natural expression," she said thoughtfully. "But more than that, you have discipline. You listen carefully to what you play. That is rare." She did not know how to respond, so she simply nodded. "Would you be willing to meet me sometime?" the woman asked. "I teach music. Not here but nearby." Her eyes widened slightly. "You teach?" "For many years," the woman replied with a gentle smile. "And I believe you deserve proper guidance." Before she could answer, the organizer signaled that it was time to continue. She returned to the bench, heart full of emotions she could barely name. As the evening moved forward, something remarkable happened. The event, which had started with tension and embarrassment, began to feel special. Guests seemed more engaged. Conversations between pieces were softer. A few even approached her mother quietly to ask about her. Her mother stood near the back, watching with shining eyes. She had always known her daughter loved music. But seeing her on that stage under those lights was something else entirely. Near the end of the hour, she played her strongest piece. It was the one she practiced most often at home, even when neighbors complained about the repeated notes. Carried emotion from beginning to end. When the final note echoed and faded, the applause this time was louder. Not because of surprise, but because of appreciation. She stood up slowly, unsure whether to bow or simply step back. The elderly woman clapped firmly. The organizer joined in enthusiastically. A few guests even stood. It was not about fame. It was not about becoming known overnight. It was about a moment when doubt had been replaced with belief. As she stepped away from the piano once more, she realized something important. Earlier that evening, she had felt humiliated for touching the instrument. Now, that same piano had become the reason the entire event continued successfully. and the girl who had once felt out of place in that grand hall no longer felt invisible. When the applause slowly faded, the hall did not return to its earlier noise. Instead, it held a calm energy that had not been there before. People were not just talking for the sake of filling silence anymore. They were talking about her. She stepped away from the piano, unsure of where to stand. For most of the evening, she had tried to stay invisible. Now, remaining unnoticed was impossible. The organizer approached her first. His tone was different from earlier. Softer, almost respectful. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "I owe you an apology. I judged too quickly." She was not expecting that. Adults rarely apologize to someone her age, especially in public. She nodded gently. "It's okay," she replied, and she meant it, because somehow, the embarrassment from earlier no longer felt heavy. It felt distant, like something that had happened long ago. Guests began approaching her one by one. Not all at once, but gradually. Some asked how long she had been learning. Others asked where she studied. A few simply said, "Well done." Each question felt strange. She was not used to being the center of attention. She answered honestly every time. "I taught myself. I practice at home. No, I never had lessons." The answers surprised them. Near the side of the stage, the elderly music teacher watched these conversations carefully. She seemed less interested in the compliments and more interested in the way the girl responded. Humble, calm, not proud, not bitter. Her mother finally made her way toward her. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling widely. "You never told me you could play like that," her mother said softly. She gave a small, shy smile. "I didn't know I could either." They shared a quiet laugh. It was a simple moment, but one she would remember forever. As the evening continued, the organizer made a small announcement. He thanked everyone for their patience and publicly acknowledged her for stepping in when the event needed music the most. The guests applauded again, this time with genuine warmth. But something else was happening beneath the surface. A few of the earlier critics stood together, speaking in low tones. Their expressions were thoughtful, even slightly embarrassed. One of them eventually walked over to her. "I must admit," he said carefully, "I underestimated you earlier." She looked at him, remembering the quiet laugh. "It happens," she replied gently. He nodded, clearly unsure how to continue, then added, "You have real talent. Don't waste it." Those words stayed with her. As the night began to wind down, the elderly teacher approached her once more. "I meant what I said earlier," the teacher began. "I would like to teach you." Her heart skipped again. The idea felt unreal. "But lessons are expensive," she replied honestly. "My family cannot afford." The teacher raised her hand softly to stop her. "Talent like yours deserves support. If you are willing to work hard, we will find a way." She glanced at her mother, unsure. Her mother looked both surprised and hopeful. "Do you really think she has potential?" her mother asked carefully. "I have spent my life around music," the teacher said, "and I know dedication when I see it. She has more than talent. She has hunger." The word hunger did not mean food. It meant desire, determination. The girl felt her throat tighten slightly. For years, she had practiced quietly without knowing if it meant anything. Without knowing if she was good or just imagining things. Now someone with experience was telling her it mattered. Before leaving, the teacher wrote down an address and a phone number on a small card. "Come this Saturday," she said. "Bring nothing but yourself." After the guests began leaving, the hall slowly returned to quiet. Workers cleared tables. Decorations were removed. The piano lid was gently lowered. She stood near it one last time before helping her mother gather supplies. Earlier that evening, the instrument had felt distant, almost forbidden. Now it felt like the beginning of something new. On the way home, the streets were calm. The night air was cool. She walked beside her mother in comfortable silence. "Were you scared?" her mother asked after a while. "Yes," she admitted. "Then why did you keep playing?" She thought carefully before answering. "Because when I play, I forget to be scared." Her mother smiled. At home, she sat in front of her old keyboard. The cracked plastic edges and missing keys did not look embarrassing anymore. They looked like the first steps of a long journey. She pressed a note gently. It buzzed slightly as always, but tonight it sounded different to her. Not smaller, just familiar. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A short video clip of her performance had been recorded by a guest and shared online. By afternoon, it had spread across the town's local social media pages. Comments poured in. Who is this girl? Where did she learn? Incredible. Some of her classmates saw it. Messages began appearing on her phone. Friends she barely spoke to suddenly wanted to talk about music. At school, whispers followed her in the hallway, but this time they were not mocking. They were curious, impressed. One teacher even stopped her after class. I saw your performance, he said. I had no idea you played piano. She smiled politely. Not many people did. That afternoon, she visited the community center again. This time, she did not sit outside. She stood near the doorway confidently. The sound of the piano inside no longer felt distant or unreachable. She realized something important. The night at the event had not only changed how others saw her. It had changed how she saw herself. She was no longer just a girl who liked music in secret. She was someone who could stand in a room full of doubt and still create something beautiful. Saturday arrived quickly. Her hands were slightly nervous again as she and her mother walked toward the address written on the small card. It led to a modest house with a large window facing the street. Through the glass, she could see the outline of an upright piano. The door opened before they could knock. The elderly teacher welcomed them warmly. Ready? She asked gently. She nodded. As she stepped inside, she felt that same quiet excitement she had felt when she first touched the grand piano at the event. But this time, there was no laughter waiting. There was only opportunity. She sat at the teacher's piano and placed her fingers on the keys. Play something you love, the teacher instructed. She began. The notes filled the small room, simple but sincere. The teacher listened carefully, not interrupting. When she finished, the teacher smiled. Yes, she said softly. This is only the beginning. And for the first time, the girl truly believed it. The first official lesson felt nothing like the night at the Grand Hall. There were no bright lights, no well-dressed guests, no whispers waiting to judge her. The room was small and quiet, filled with shelves of music books and framed photos from past performances. Sunlight entered gently through the window, touching the polished surface of the upright piano. She sat straight on the bench, hands resting on her lap, trying to hide how nervous she felt. The teacher noticed immediately. You do not have to impress me, she said kindly. We are here to build, not to prove. Those words settled something inside her. Instead of asking her to play a full piece, the teacher began with the basics. Hand position, finger strength, posture. At first, it surprised her. She had already performed in front of an entire hall. Why return to simple exercises? But within minutes, she realized how much she did not know. Her fingers sometimes curved incorrectly. Her shoulders tensed without her noticing. Her timing, though emotional, was uneven in certain parts. The teacher did not criticize. She corrected gently. You have strong instincts, she explained. Now we polish them. The lesson lasted 2 hours, but it felt shorter. By the end, her fingers were slightly tired, but her mind felt wide awake. When she and her mother stepped outside, she held the sheet of exercises tightly in her hand. It was not glamorous. It did not look impressive, but it was real progress. The following weeks became part of a new routine. School during the day, homework in the afternoon, practice in the evening, lessons every Saturday. Her old keyboard at home still had missing keys, but she learned to adjust. The teacher sometimes allowed her extra practice time at her house. Slowly, the difference between self-taught guessing and trained technique became clear. At school, people still talked about her performance. The video continued to circulate. A few students who had never spoken to her before began sitting near her during lunch. Play something, one of them asked one day. tapping the table like it was a keyboard. She laughed lightly. This isn't a piano. But she noticed something new. The same people who once overlooked her were now curious about her talent. Still, she stayed careful. She did not want praise to change her. She remembered too clearly how quickly respect could disappear. One afternoon, the teacher brought unexpected news. There is a small youth recital next month, she said. It is not as large as the event you played at, but it is important. Would you like to participate? Her heart jumped. Will there be trained students there? She asked quietly. Yes, the teacher replied honestly. Many have studied for years. A wave of doubt rushed in. The night at the hall had been special, but it had also been unusual. She had stepped in during a delay. Expectations were low. Surprise had worked in her favor. This would be different. People would expect skill. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. The teacher looked at her steadily. You will never feel fully ready. Growth happens when you step forward anyway. That sentence stayed with her all week. She practiced harder than ever. Not just playing through melodies, but breaking them into parts. Fixing weak transitions. Strengthening her left hand. Counting rhythm carefully instead of relying only on emotion. There were frustrating evenings too. Times when her fingers would not cooperate. Times when she felt stuck. Once, she pushed away from the keyboard in frustration. Maybe that night was just luck, she muttered softly. Her mother, who had been folding clothes nearby, paused. Luck does not practice every evening, she said gently. Those simple words pulled her back. The day of the recital arrived sooner than she expected. The venue was modest. A local auditorium with soft yellow lighting and rows of neatly arranged chairs. Families filled the seats, cameras ready. The atmosphere felt serious but supportive. Backstage, she watched other students warm up. Their movements looked confident. Some discussed composers and techniques she was only beginning to understand. Her palms felt slightly damp. The teacher approached her quietly. Nervous? Yes. Good, the teacher replied. It means you care. When her name was called, the sound echoed through the auditorium. She walked toward the stage, each step steady but careful. This time, there were no whispers of doubt. But there were expectations. She sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench as she had been taught. She placed her hands in position and took one slow breath. The first note rang out clearly. Immediately, she felt the difference in herself. Months earlier, she had played from pure emotion. Now, emotion and control worked together. She focused on the structure of the piece. The soft introduction, the rising middle, the strong ending. Halfway through, she allowed herself to feel the music again. Not as escape, but as expression. The audience listened quietly. No movement, no distractions. When she reached the final section, her fingers moved with confidence she had never felt before. Not rushed, not hesitant. The last note faded. Silence. Then applause, warm and steady. She stood and gave a small bow, just as the teacher had shown her. Backstage, the teacher met her with a proud smile. You see, she said softly. This applause felt different from the first one at the event hall. That night had been about surprise. This moment was about growth. Later, small certificates were handed out. She did not win first place. Another student with years of experience received the top recognition. For a brief second, disappointment touched her heart. But then she remembered something important. Months ago, she had been afraid to even touch a piano in public. Now she had stood confidently among trained performers. When they returned home that evening, she did not feel defeated. She felt motivated. I want to get better, she told her mother quietly. You will, her mother replied. Opportunities began appearing slowly. A local cafe invited her to play during a weekend evening. The community center, the same place where she once sat outside listening, offered her a chance to perform during a small gathering. The first time she walked into that building not as a listener, but as a performer, she felt a deep sense of quiet victory. The journey was no longer about proving others wrong. It was about proving to herself that she belonged. And every time her fingers touched the keys now, she no longer felt like a girl who had been ridiculed. She felt like someone building her future note by note. Months passed, but the memory of that first night at the grand hall never fully disappeared. It no longer felt painful. Instead, it felt like a turning point, the moment when everything quietly shifted. Her days became fuller. School in the morning, practice in the afternoon, lessons on the weekend, and occasional small performances in between. Life was still simple at home. The walls were still thin. The winters were still cold. But something inside the house had changed. There was more hope in the air. Her old keyboard remained on the small wooden table near the window, but now it was joined by sheet music carefully stacked beside it. The teacher had lent her books to study. Some pages were worn from years of use, but to her they felt precious. One evening, after finishing a long practice session, she sat quietly and looked at her reflection in the dark window. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who stood outside buildings just to hear music through half-open doors, the one who almost walked away from the piano that night because of laughter. She realized something important. The biggest change was not that other people respected her now. The biggest change was that she respected herself. At school, teachers began encouraging her to consider music competitions at a higher level. One even helped her apply for a regional youth music program that offered scholarships to talented students who could not afford formal training. Filling out the application felt strange. Writing about her journey made everything feel real. She described the broken keyboard, the community center steps, the unexpected performance at the event hall. Weeks later, a letter arrived. She held it carefully before opening it. Her hands trembled slightly, just like they had before her first public performance. She had been selected for an audition. It was not a full scholarship yet. She would need to perform before a panel of experienced musicians. The thought alone made her nervous, but this time it was a different kind of nervousness. It was not fear of being laughed at. It was fear of missing an opportunity. The teacher helped her prepare. They chose a piece that balanced technical skill and emotional depth. Every note was practiced carefully. Every mistake corrected patiently. There will be students there who have trained for many years, the teacher reminded her gently. Do not compare your beginning to someone else's middle. The audition day arrived. The building was larger than any place she had performed before. The waiting room was filled with other students, dressed neatly, some reviewing sheet music, others practicing silently on their laps. She noticed their confidence, their polished posture. For a brief moment, the old doubt tried to return. Then she remembered something. There was a time when even touching a piano in public felt impossible. Now she was here not by accident but by effort. When her name was called, she walked into the audition room with steady steps. 3 judges sat behind a long table. Their expressions were serious but not unkind. She introduced herself politely and took her seat at the piano. For a second, the room felt very quiet. She placed her fingers on the keys and began. The opening notes were soft and controlled. She focused on everything she had learned: posture, breathing, timing. As the piece developed, she allowed emotion to enter naturally, not forced, not exaggerated. She was no longer playing to impress. She was playing to express. Halfway through, she felt calm. The nervousness faded. The music carried her forward. When she finished, the silence in the room felt respectful. One of the judges leaned forward slightly. How long have you been studying formally? He asked. Less than a year, she replied honestly. They exchanged glances. Another judge smiled faintly. Thank you, she said. We will contact you soon. Waiting for results felt longer than preparing for the audition. Each day after school, she wondered if a letter would arrive. Finally, it did. She opened it slowly, heart racing. She had been awarded the scholarship. For a moment, she simply stared at the paper, unable to speak. Her mother read it twice, just to be sure. Then they both laughed and cried at the same time. The scholarship meant structured training, better instruments, performance opportunities, and mentorship from experienced musicians. It meant doors opening wider than she had ever imagined. But even with this new achievement, she did not forget where she started. One afternoon, months later, she was invited back to the same grand hall where everything had begun. This time, she was not there to help set up chairs. She was there as a featured young performer. Walking into the hall again felt surreal. The polished floors, the golden lights, the same space where laughter once followed her. She walked toward the grand piano confidently. No one questioned her presence now. No one whispered. As she sat down on the bench, she took a quiet breath and looked at the audience. Among them, she noticed familiar faces. The elderly teacher sat proudly in the front row. Her mother sat beside her, hands folded, eyes shining. She began to play. The notes filled the hall, stronger and more refined than before. Her technique had improved, but her heart remained the same. During the performance, she remembered that first night. The embarrassment, the doubt, the apology from the organizer, the unexpected applause. She realized that if she had walked away in that first moment of ridicule, none of this would have happened. The final note echoed beautifully through the hall. This time, the applause was not surprised. It was earned. As she stood to bow, she felt something deeper than pride. Gratitude. Gratitude for the broken keyboard that taught her patience. Gratitude for the teacher who saw potential. Gratitude even for the laughter that once hurt her, because it pushed her to play louder, not quieter. After the performance, a young girl approached her shyly. "I want to learn piano too," the girl said softly. "But I don't have lessons." She smiled warmly. "You don't need permission to start," she replied gently. "Just begin." Later that evening, as she stepped outside the hall, the night air felt cool and familiar. She paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. The journey ahead was still long. There would be harder pieces to learn, bigger stages, greater challenges. But she was no longer the girl who doubted whether she belonged near a piano. She belonged wherever music was played. And the same hands that were once pulled away from the keys in embarrassment had now shaped a future built on courage, discipline, and quiet belief. The laughter had faded long ago, but the music remained.